let me introduce to you our speaker. Of course, many of you joined because you know Anu Bradford about the term that she coined, the Brussels effect, and her first book, which was called The Brussels Effect, How the European Union Rules the World, published in 2020, which was named one of the best books of 2020 by Foreign Affairs. Her new book that she will speak about today has also already been named a best book by the Financial Times, and we are very much looking forward to learning more about it. Of course, I'm particularly excited because I'm currently also writing a book, finishing up a book project, Anu knows a little bit about, called Governing Digital China. So I see my role later on to sort of use my China and also Europe hat to pose some questions. But as I said before, please use this opportunity really to pose any questions you may have about Anu's work. So Anu, without further ado, the floor is all yours.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Daniela, and thank you all for joining. This is truly an exciting audience for me to engage with. There's incredible work that is being done at Hertie, so I am very eager to hear your questions and comments, and then after the initial remarks, move to that conversation. So let me maybe start with the some general premises for the book, why I wrote it and what the starting point is. So I start from this assumption that I'm observing that there is increasingly now globally a consensus that technology needs to be regulated, but there is no consensus on what that regulation would look like. So in the digital empires, I argue that there are three primary ways to think about digital regulation. There is the American market-driven model, there is the Chinese state-driven model, and then there's a European, what I call a rights-driven model. So the American market-driven model really prioritizes free speech, free internet, and incentives to innovate. So the government is reserved only a minimal role, and the governance of technology is basically handed over largely to the tech companies. So it is a techno-libertarian, techno-optimist view of the world. The Chinese, on the other hand, they are very focused on making China a technological superpower. And under the state-driven model, they are prepared to leverage state resources to meet that goal. But China is also leveraging technology as a tool for surveillance and propaganda and censorship in an effort to preserve the political power of the Communist Party and then to ensure social stability in the nation. So in this debate, the Europeans are often portrayed as being forced to choose between the US and China because the Europeans lack a thriving technology industry on its own that would be comparable to the two superpowers in the domain of technology. But in the book, I argue that the Europeans are not prepared to, nor are they forced to choose between the Chinese and the American model. The Chinese model for the Europeans is simply too oppressive, but at the same time, the American model is viewed as too permissive. So the Europeans have carved out their own third path forward. And this is premised on a human-centric digital transformation, a regulatory model under which the Europeans are maximizing the fundamental rights of individuals, the preservation of democratic structures of the society, and they also incorporate a notion of a more fair distribution of the gains from digital transformation. So the idea is that we are redistributing power away from large platforms to smaller companies, to digital citizens, and to the public and society at large. So these are the primary regulatory models that I'm using as an analytical framework. But you may wonder why I call these three leading technology and regulatory powers digital empires. So empires is a big term, it is a provocative term, and I use it more metaphorically. But at the same time, I think it is conceptually helpful for us for the following reason, is that none of the three regulatory models are confined to the jurisdictions themselves. Instead, each empire is proactively exporting its own regulatory model abroad. But what is interesting is that each of the regulatory powers are exporting something different. The Americans are primarily exporting the private power of US tech companies, which basically were set free to take over the world, which they have effectively done. So companies like Meta's Facebook has 3 billion users in 160 countries. And through this global presence, by offering the services and products to the users around the world, they are also exporting this American market-driven model that all of us are now accustomed to. The Chinese are exporting something different. They are primarily exporting infrastructure power. So Chinese tech companies are building 5G networks, undersea cables, data centers, smart cities, safe cities along this digital Silk Road that reaches across Asia, many parts of Africa, Latin America, and even Europe. So if the Americans are exporting the private power of the tech companies, Chinese are building the infrastructures, what is the export of the Europeans? Europeans are exporting the superpower they have, which is regulation. So this is now tying to my earlier work on the Brussels effect, and I argue it is also taking place in the domain of digital economy. So Europe often takes the lead in drafting regulations for the technology companies, and then through the globalization of practices of tech companies, they business decision to often adopt those standards across their global conduct or global production. These companies are then exporting the European digital regulations across the global marketplace. So if the first argument of the book was that this is not just a US-China game, the EU is also an empire. The EU is a player. We should focus on 3 players. The second argument is that this is not just a digital world that we would think about in terms of a splinternet, where we would have these separate spheres of influence that do not overlap. Because each empire is contributing a different layer to the global digital governance. You have many non-aligned markets or unaligned powers where you see Chinese infrastructure, American tech companies, and European regulations present at the same time, which means that these digital empires are coexisting and at times colliding in the global marketplace. And this really leads to the kind of battles that the book then talks about. And I distinguish between 2 levels of regulatory battles. I talk about horizontal battles and vertical battles, and these 2 intersect. So horizontal battles are really the battles between the empires themselves. The most notorious battle being the ongoing and constantly escalating US-China tech war. It is a war for technological supremacy, a battle for economic, geopolitical, military, and ideological strength in the domain of technology. But we also can witness regulatory battles, another horizontal battle mainly taking place between the United States and Europe, where the US companies have come to the European marketplace, where Europeans feel that they are overextending their power. They are exercising the kind of economic power, political power, cultural power, informational power that is too much for the Europeans, which is why the Europeans have asserted themselves and then extended their regulations to reach those American tech companies, which has then occasionally led to criticism in the US saying it's not that our companies are overreaching, it's your regulators that are overreaching and seeking to govern our companies as well. So in addition to those horizontal battles between the empires, each empire is battling vertically the tech companies in their own marketplace. So we see constant efforts by the governments to regulate their tech companies in their own markets. Even the United States government is now rethinking its techno-libertarian convictions and is looking to start regulating the US tech companies. Many of you may have seen the executive order by President Biden in the domain of artificial intelligence. That's pretty far removed from a pure market-driven model. That has a very much the same tone as the European rights-driven model. But at the same time, the Americans are considering digital regulation in the shadow of that horizontal battle. They are worried that if they are too vigorous in restraining the tech companies in their domestic market, they are eroding the very asset they need to prevail in the horizontal battle. They need these tech companies to be successful. They need them to innovate. They need them to lead in AI so that they win the horizontal battle, which means we will see more restraint in those vertical battles. It's only so far the Americans are willing to go. But the same way we see restraint in the horizontal battle, the Americans are not going all the way restricting the flow of American technology to the Chinese market because the American companies need access to that Chinese market. So we see more restraint alongside rivalry in these various battles. So let me now move to the question that may interest many of you, which is who wins these battles, who prevails, what happens in the horizontal battle, and what happens in the vertical battle. And here I'm prepared to make a couple of predictions in the book. And one of them is that I predict the decline of the American digital empire. The US is losing the ideological battle. There are very few individuals or governments around the world that anymore trust the governance of technology to the tech companies themselves. Instead, there is now move away from the techno-libertarian worldview, whereby governments around the world are adopting privacy regulations, asserting their antitrust, their competition regulations, rethinking the disinformation, looking for ways to regulate content, and now there's a global conversation on the need to regulate artificial intelligence. So this all is a move away clearly from the American market-driven model that is widely seen as inept today to govern the challenges of today's digital economy. So if the American market-driven model is no longer having the same kind of global appeal, that is good news for the European rights-driven model, which is gaining more traction also outside of the EU, especially in the democratic world. In countries like Canada, Australia, or South Korea, or Japan, or New Zealand, the governments are looking to the ways that Europe is governing the digital economy. However, there are potentially three concerns that I want to share with you that are giving governments some pause as to whether the European regulatory model is the right one. The first concern is this idea that can the European rights-driven regulatory model actually be compatible with innovation? Will it mean that if we move towards the European model, we will see less successful tech companies emerge? And this is driven really by this this observation that Europeans are very good at writing regulations. We all know about the GDPR, but it takes us a longer time to name a European tech company. Europe does not produce leading tech companies, which many attribute to excessive digital regulation. I don't think digital regulation is the problem, even though I do worry about European competitiveness. And I think there are other reasons that explain why the Europeans haven't managed to compete with, for instance, Americans that have very little to do with the European commitment to protect the fundamental rights or otherwise regulate the digital economy. So let me just mention four that I think are much more important. So one is that compared to the United States, there is no integrated digital single market in the EU. It is very hard for tech companies to grow in the EU. They cannot scale if they face barriers that follow the national boundaries in the EU. Second, there is no deep, integrated, robust capital markets in the EU. Capital markets are also balkanized, which makes it much harder to fund your innovations in the EU. Third issue, risk-taking is actively discouraged under European cultural outlook, but also under European legislative frameworks. I blame bankruptcy laws, which are punitive in most European countries. It is often fatal to fail in the EU. You cannot take risks because if you fail, you cannot raise money again, and you are not given a second chance. Whereas failure is built into the Silicon Valley and American whole tech ecosystem and that regulatory model. We want the entrepreneurs to try big things, to kind of head towards the cliff, and some fall off the cliff, but that's just part of the system. It's a rite of passage. You fail, then you raise money again, and maybe the next time you're very successful. So Americans are much more comfortable with failure, which also means they are much more comfortable for pursuing disruptive, risky innovations, which is absolutely critical for tech economy. And let me name a fourth issue that I think really explains why the Europeans are not succeeding at the level of Americans, which is Americans are much better in harnessing the global talent to benefit American innovation base. So over 50% of over $1 billion startups in the US have an immigrant founder. And if we for a moment just look at the household names, the leading platform companies and their founders, Steve Jobs of Apple is a son of a Syrian immigrant. Jeff Bezos of Amazon is a second-generation Cuban immigrant. Elon Musk of Tesla is South African. Sergey Brin, the co-founder of Google, is a Russian, and Eduardo Saverin, a co-founder of Facebook, is Brazilian. These are just examples of how America has been so successful in being a magnet for global talent. The Europeans are not succeeding at the same rate. So I spent some extra time laying these out because I want to debunk this myth that somehow Europeans are behind because they committed to digital regulation. I don't think that if we now decided to scrap the GDPR or decide never to go ahead with the AI Act, that somehow a year from now or 5 years from now, there would be massive tech economy emanating from Europe. There are all these other elements, other pillars of the tech ecosystem that the Europeans need to work on, which also means that if the Americans, that still remain somewhat hesitant, now where to move towards the European rights-driven model. It's not that somehow we would not have innovation coming from the United States. The federal privacy law in the US would not dismantle the US capital markets or prevent the global talent from finding their way to the United States. So back to my question of what are the potential hesitations about the growing success of the EU regulatory model. I don't think over-regulation is the problem. I'm much more worried about the Europeans underdoing it, by which I mean the Europeans are very good at writing regulations, but they don't have the good track record of enforcing the regulations. So we do not see as successful implementation and as effective enforcement of that ambitious regulatory agenda, which means if the Europeans fail to really translate these regulations into effective market outcomes, their victory in this horizontal battle is a hollow one. In practice, the American market-driven model prevails if these regulations cannot be effectively enforced. Third concern that I have about the European model's victory. It's doing well in the democratic world, but it doesn't have many takers in the authoritarian or authoritarian-leaning world, and that part of the world is constantly growing. There are many developing countries, many countries that are authoritarian that have no interest in rights-driven model. They are much more drawn to the Chinese state-driven model. And I think there are a couple of reasons why it is very difficult for Europeans and for the Americans, if they try to work with the Europeans and persuade the rest of the world not to emulate the Chinese model, not to take the Chinese infrastructure, and rather align themselves with the global techno-democracies. One issue is that I mentioned this Chinese infrastructure power. That infrastructure is vital for many countries' digital development. That is the path that they cannot afford to say no to, especially if there is no alternative. Chinese infrastructure is pretty good and it is affordable, and often it is the only game in town. The Europeans have a couple of alternatives to Huawei, Nokia and Ericsson. They don't come with the kind of financial subsidies that allow the countries to acquire them at a reasonable rate that the Chinese government is providing to support the Chinese infrastructure acquisitions. Second issue, and this is something that I was very uncomfortable writing in the book. I wrote this paragraph and I did not like it, but it had to be there because I think it happens to be intellectually honest and true. China has shown to the world that political freedom is not necessary for innovation. They have managed to create a thriving tech economy without being free. So it's very hard for the US and the EU to go to the rest of the world and tell them that, look, you should not take the Chinese model, because if you follow the Chinese model, the state-driven one, you will gain control, but you will not see economic growth. These countries look at China and say, look, I think we can get both. We can have the political control and we can have innovation and economic growth. Here, my slight caveat is, which I'm watching very carefully right now, is that in generative AI, the Chinese companies are lagging behind their US counterpart. And one challenge for Chinese companies here is that any generative AI model needs to be consistent with the censorship regime, which limits the amount of data that you can use and the ways that you can use the data to train these models. So there may be a chance for the US and the EU to say that we are vindicated. Ultimately, freedom does correlate with greater innovation. But let me now move to the most important battle of all, the one that I think really has the highest stake, and that is the battle over the future of liberal democracy. And this is the battle that leaves me most concerned. And I would want to invite you to all to consider that this battle can be lost in one of two ways. Liberal democracy will deteriorate if the US and the EU lose the horizontal battle to China. And I have given some suggestions why it might be that could be the case. Second, we also need to realize that liberal democracy will also deteriorate if the US and the EU lose their vertical battle to tech companies. A digital economy governed by tech companies and not democratic governments is also not consistent with liberal democracy. And here I am worried because the United States, even though it's now rethinking its commitment to markets and is willing to regulate, its Congress is not capable of legislating. China is capable of legislating. The Europeans are able to legislate, but they have a hard time enforcing. China doesn't have a hard time enforcing. If the Chinese Communist Party decides it's time to crack down on big tech, the Chinese Communist Party does crack down on the big tech. So what really needs to be done is for liberal democracies like the EU to show to the world that there is a liberal democratic way to govern technology that will be effective, that will be shaping the outcomes. Otherwise, we are forced to concede that digital economy is either governed by authoritarians, whereby democratic governments are destined to fail in that same endeavor, or in liberal democracies, the digital economy is governed by tech companies. And neither is a good outcome for anybody who believes in liberal democracy as a foundation of digital society and human engagement, because that would force us to conclude that the true digital empires are the authoritarians and the tech companies.